Blessed be the name of the Lord. Today I want to take a look at the book of Daniel. It's a prophetic book that tells us quite a lot about the last days. And there are some interesting parallels with the book of Revelation in Daniel. Also, Daniel gives us quite a comprehensive description of the beast, the so-called Antichrist. And in this video, we will look briefly at the remarkable events that happened to Daniel, the supernatural deliverance and dreams and visions. In part 2, we'll mostly examine what Daniel was told about the beast / the Antichrist. So this is part 1 of my message, chapters 1 to 6. The first half of Daniel is quite straightforward. Now, the 4 major themes in Daniel are the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Number 2 would be Daniel thrown into the lion's den. Number 3, Daniel's friends thrown into the fiery furnace. And then also the prophecies about the 4 kingdoms, including the Antichrist, the final beast. The final beast, the Antichrist, those prophecies are mostly in the second half. And that's also the prophecies about the coming of Jesus, or maybe not. We'll take a look at those in chapter 7 and 9 and other chapters. There's more than one chapter talking about the last days in Daniel. In addition, there's a few noteworthy verses that got my attention, but this is not going to be a verse-by-verse exposition because that would just take too long. So this is going to be what I like to call relevant and contemporary commentary. Just the things that are relevant to us today. At the end of these videos, you will have a better understanding of the last days and the beast / the Antichrist. So the book of Daniel was written by Daniel. He was a Jew from Judea. The events take place about 600, maybe 550 years before Christ. We're not quite sure. Judea, which was in the south, at that time Israel was split into south and north. So Judah was in the south, and it was conquered by Babylon, which is where Iraq is today. And the Judeans were taken captive to serve in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And this is the story of Daniel and his 3 friends as they were taken to the palace of the king, because they looked like they could be of value to Babylon. That's in Daniel 1:4. Their names were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the names were changed to the local Babylonian names. So chapter 1 is an introduction giving us the background of the story, telling us how Daniel and the other 3 got there, and it also mentions the so-called Daniel's diet. It was quite a fad about 15 years ago. It's basically a vegetarian diet avoiding sweets, alcohol, and meat. Chapter 2. See how fast we're moving? We're already in chapter 2. Chapter 2 describes the dream about the 4 empires. That was the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. He saw a great image. He dreamed of a big statue, and that statue had a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, and the middle and thighs of bronze, but the legs were of iron and feet were partly iron and clay. This is the 4 empires ruling the earth throughout the human history. As far as God is concerned, there have only been 4 empires on earth: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And notice how it all gets progressively worse, less valuable, inferior, from gold to iron and clay. Non-believers usually think that life gets better as time goes by, that everything improves. But that's not true. According to the Bible and the laws of physics, things get worse as time goes by. From beautiful and valuable gold, we go down to clay and iron. And then it says that a stone was cut by no human hand, and that stone basically shattered the statue. All of those empires, from Babylon to Rome, were defeated by the stone, and that stone is Jesus Christ. Now, Daniel was able to tell Nebuchadnezzar the dream, and he was able to interpret the dream, because Nebuchadnezzar never revealed the dream to his spiritual advisors, of which Daniel was one. And in Daniel 2:45 it says, "The dream is certain and its interpretation is sure," which basically means that God's plan always prevails. God's prophecies always happen. The king of Babylon, being a pagan, didn't know about Yahweh, But when Daniel told him the dream, he realized that Yahweh is the true God, because Daniel said, "This is all revealed to me by my God." And then Nebuchadnezzar said to Daniel, "Your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries." He acknowledged that Yahweh is the God over everything. And then Daniel was promoted. He was made a ruler over the whole province of Babylon and a chief prefect over all those wise men of Babylon. The wise men, those were the Magi, the same as the Magi who later came to see Jesus born in Bethlehem. So then Daniel was appointed to be in charge of all, second only to the king, and his friends were promoted too. Moving on to chapter 3. In chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, and he ordered everybody to worship it, which is kind of surprising, because he just learned about Yahweh being king of all, but yet he succumbs to worshiping false gods. This was a very large statue. It was about 25 meters, 70 feet. And at that point, some of the locals used that opportunity to plot against the Jews, because they knew that the Jews would not worship the statue because they had a different god. So the locals went to the king and they said, "Those 3 Jews whom you have appointed, the friends of Daniel, they pay no attention to you. They do not serve your God or worship the golden image that you have set up." And the king got mad and ordered the 3 friends of Daniel to be thrown into a fiery furnace. The furnace was so hot that even king's men who threw Daniel's friends into the furnace died because of the heat. The king looked inside the furnace, trying to see if they were still alive, and he saw that they were walking inside the furnace, and there was somebody else walking inside the furnace along with them. And the king said, "The 4th one looks like a son of the gods." So this was a supernatural deliverance, a miracle. God intervened, suspending the natural laws, and protected Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These were their Babylonian names, because they trusted in him. The 4th one walking with them in the fire was definitely an angel of Yahweh, possibly, very likely, Jesus himself. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked out of the fire not even singed, and the king promoted them again, and their accusers were executed. And Nebuchadnezzar saw that Yahweh sovereignly protects those who trust in him. So the king made it a decree that everybody should worship the God of those Jews. What's interesting in chapter 3 is that worshiping the golden statue that the king of Babylon made is a foreshadow of worshiping the image of the beast. So everybody in physical Babylon had to worship the golden statue. Now in the last days, before the second coming, everybody in the spiritual Babylon, which will be the whole world very soon, will have to worship the image of the beast, a statue. Now, Daniel's friends did not worship the statue of the false god, and Yahweh protected them. The true God protected them. And we must not worship the image of the beast, the false god, and God will protect us. Chapter 4. Daniel was renamed Belteshazzar, after one of the false gods worshipped in Babylon, and his title was Chief Magician. He was the main Magi. Yet that didn't bother him too much, because he knew where his heart was. And then Nebuchadnezzar had another dream, and this time it was a tree, gigantic tree that represented the king himself. It says that the leaves were beautiful, and the fruit was abundant, and it was food for all. So basically it's acknowledged here that the king of Babylon was not such a bad king. Everybody in his kingdom was well fed. The beasts of the field found shade. The birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. And then we read, "I saw in my vision, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven." This is very interesting because we have that word watcher. There's a lot about watchers in the book of Enoch. And there's a lot of videos and people saying that the watchers are the fallen angels or demons or whatever. But in Daniel, the watcher is described as a holy one. It's just a different category of angels, and they are not fallen angels or demons, but a type of God's angels. So we have seraphim, we have cherubim, And they have different functions in God's world. And apparently we have watchers as well. And they may have another function. Obviously they watch, but also they issue judgments, decrees. We'll look at that in a second. Now, the mentions of watchers in the book of Enoch does not validate the book of Enoch. It just tells us that watchers exist. And outside of Apocrypha, watchers are only mentioned in the book of Daniel. And the book of Enoch most likely just repeated the term watchers after Daniel because it was written after Daniel. The book of Enoch wasn't written by Enoch thousands of years ago. It was probably written much later. It's one of those pseudepigrapha books that falsely attribute their authorship to famous prophets and other well-known persons from the Bible. They are not really fully inspired by God. They may contain some truths, but also errors and inconsistencies. A lot of those books were written around the 1st century, 2nd, 3rd centuries, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, and they cause a lot of confusion, and they don't belong in the Bible, in the canon. And that's why they are in Apocrypha. But anyways, the sentence against the king in that dream was by the decree of the watchers. So the watchers have a lot of power in God's kingdom. They issue decrees, judgments. I mean, I'm sure it was all done in agreement with God, because in heaven everything happens by one Spirit. But it says here that it was by the decree of the watchers. And as a result of that judgment, King Nebuchadnezzar was sent to live like an animal in the forest for 7 years. And that's because he needed to be humble. That's because he saw that Daniel's God, Yahweh, was the true God of this universe, and yet he still didn't acknowledge him as the one true God over all. And also there were some lapses in his righteousness and justice. And for that, God decided to humble Nebuchadnezzar and send him to live like an animal in the forest for 7 years. After 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar was restored to his kingship and turned away from his false gods to worship Yahweh. In Daniel 4:37, we read that after his return, Nebuchadnezzar proclaimed, "I praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble." These verses, they look like a mixture of Psalms and Proverbs. Nebuchadnezzar understood all that. He knew firsthand because that's exactly what happened to him. Now, a very important theme in the book of Daniel is the sovereignty of God. And I'm going to insert a little bit about God being sovereign over all before we go to chapter 5. So we find those verses in 4:17, 4:25, and 5:18. Mostly. The sovereignty of God is stated very directly in those verses. It says that the Most High, that's 4:25, rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. God appoints rulers to countries. So it would seem that people do get the governments that they deserve. It's all by God's decisions. In 5:18, it says, "The Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty." So the king of Babylon was appointed by Yahweh. Nebuchadnezzar didn't achieve his glory and majesty by his own strength. It was given to him from above. And in Daniel 4:17, it says, "The Most High rules the kingdom of man and gives it to whom he will, and he sets over it the lowest of men." Overall, the description of Babylon is somewhat positive. The king wished everybody peace, everybody was well fed, and the king was a blessing, although he didn't always do the right thing. Because Daniel said, "Break off your sins." Break off your sins by practicing righteousness and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed. So not everything was perfect. There was some oppression, some injustice. And of course the king was an idolater, worshipping a false god, false gods, plural. But overall, it wasn't that bad, and it was a kingdom of gold. Chapter 5. Chapter 5 talks about King Belshazzar, who was Nebuchadnezzar's son. He was partying in his palace, giving praise to his false gods, while drinking from gold cups stolen from the Jewish temple, and for that God judged him. That's in Daniel 5:4. They drank wine, praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, So those are idols. And immediately the fingers of a human hand appear and wrote on the plaster of the wall. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. It seems like only the king could see that, because that was a supernatural event. So Daniel was brought in again to interpret the writing on the wall. And yes, that's where the saying comes from. The writing on the wall is from Daniel 5. And Daniel spoke directly and honestly to Belshazzar. He didn't sugarcoat it, he didn't try to flatter the king, but he stated it boldly. You, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of this house have been brought in before you, and your lords and your wives' concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, stone, which do not see or hear or know. So that's idols again. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. That's a beautiful phrase right there. God in whose hand is your breath. So Belshazzar was struck dead at that party, but before he died, Daniel was honored again, despite criticizing the king. And Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck, and they proclaimed him to be the third ruler in the kingdom. He was the third, not the second, because there were two kings in Babylon at that time. And that very night the king was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom. Darius was from Persia. Persia conquered Babylon, and the exiled Jews found themselves under a different ruler. And the world moved on to the Second Empire, from Babylon to Persia. Now what I want to notice here is that they dressed Daniel in purple as a reward, as a sign of honor. So being dressed in purple is not only for the popes. I'm saying this because in the book of Revelation, we read about the beast, and the woman on the beast dressed in purple and scarlet, and the colors of Babylon are scarlet and purple. And today the Catholic bishops and the Pope in the Vatican, they dress in purple and scarlet. So many assume that the beast, the Antichrist, comes out of Rome, out of the Vatican. But dressing in purple goes way back. It's always for the rich, and important rulers were the ones who dressed in purple, as far back as Babylon and probably earlier. In this case, it was about 600 years before Jesus, maybe 550, many centuries anyways before Rome as the church was even created. And I'm not defending the Catholic Church, and the Pope may very well be the false prophet, but it's helpful to keep the historical perspective. Daniel himself wore purple robes. On another note, when it comes to honoring the king and authorities, which is in the New Testament, honor the king, respect authorities, we read in Daniel that Daniel did honor Darius. He said, "May the king live forever." But also he spoke straight to Belshazzar. In Daniel 5:22, he said to Belshazzar, "You have not humbled your heart, you are basically worshiping false idols, and the one true God does not like it." So honoring the king does not mean we're not to criticize the authorities. Honoring the king does not mean we cannot criticize the authorities, especially if they transgress the law of God. Puritans did that, and that's why King James wanted them out, and he wanted his own version of the Bible. That's a different story. Chapter 6. New king arrives, King Darius, and he favored Daniel as well. And the locals were jealous again and started plotting against Daniel, the Jew, again. Yes, he was a Jew, and many of these locals were Iranians, in addition to the local Babylonians, because Darius must have brought in his own entourage with him. And they couldn't find anything legitimate against Daniel, so they said, unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. It came down to worship. It came down to Daniel's religion. And that's how they persecute Christians as well. They persecute us for our beliefs, not for our deeds. They persecute us for our connection to the law of God. For example, such as God created them male and female. So Christians cannot accept homosexuality, transgenderism, etc. That is the law of God. And so much as in Daniel, they accuse us for our connection to the law of God, as Daniel was accused. So the locals in Babylon, they set up a new law. No one was allowed to worship any gods but King Darius. King was God. For 30 days, if anybody prayed to a different god than King Darius, they would be cast into the den of lions. And that's how Daniel came to be thrown into the den of lions, because he prayed every day, 3 times a day. That's in Daniel 6:13. So they brought it up to the king, and they threw Daniel into the den of lions. The king felt bad about it, but couldn't do anything because that was the law. Daniel broke the law, and the king could not just pardon Daniel. And that's another difference between the kingdom of silver, which Persia was, and the kingdom of iron and clay, in which we are today. The king had to follow the law. He could not pardon Daniel at the whim. Today the rulers are often above the law, but not back then. In Persia, the law applied the same way to everybody. So the king said, "May your God whom you serve continually deliver you." Daniel 6:16. Daniel spent the night in the den, fasting, and he survived. God delivered him supernaturally, as his friends were delivered from the fiery furnace. And then his accusers, with their families, were thrown to the lions, and they died. Then King Darius of Iran, Persia, made a decree. "I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel." So basically, he tried to make it a state religion to worship Yahweh. We know from history that didn't stick, and they never became followers of the one true God. Faith is a personal choice, and royal decrees don't make anybody a true believer. Now, this is the end of part 1, chapters 1 to 6. And the first half of Daniel is fairly straightforward and simple. The second half is of much more interest for those who are waiting for Jesus. In chapters 7 and 12, we read a lot about topics directly connected to the very last days. And there's a fairly detailed description of the beast, like I mentioned in the beginning. It's in more than one chapter. And there are other prophecies concerning the last days, and we will discuss them in part 2. Thank you for listening, and may the Lord richly bless you from Zion.